Industry changed a lot in countries in Central Europe that used to be part of the communist world but left it at the end of the Cold War. The 1990s were really wild for many companies, both private or still state, and just the entire economy, transitioning into the worldwide free market system. Companies were forced to completely switch their thinking, their strategies, their markets. Most of them struggled, a lot did not make it. Western companies came in, new industries emerged, new ways began with entering the new world. Let's explore how changes in industry in this part of the world at this time shaped city development. In the background, I will do 3 projects: a logistics warehouse, a new highway exit, and next to it, a car factory. Let's go. Once again, in these past couple of videos, the 1990s topics are all about changes from the previous times, which means the background of the before can be found in numerous videos in this series already. The industry or some economy I focused on in episodes 60 or 82, if you want to rewatch that. But this time a little recap is possible of the previous communist era. All industry was nationalized, companies were centralized, merged, somewhat monopolized. Investments into new industry focused on raw expansion of it, so new huge factories for thousands of workers, which went hand in hand with huge housing projects too, as these projects were all centrally planned. Sectors of industry were not quite naturally evolved, but followed that central plan, but also plans of the overall Eastern Bloc through ties, or rather a leash more accurately, from the Soviet Union. So Central Europe significantly reoriented towards heavy industry, and some countries were banned from making certain products entirely. Foreign trade was possible with the West, but severely limited, but also trading with fellow socialist countries was not particularly favorable either, which meant countries more or less manufactured everything themselves, although due to shortages of everything, did not exactly excel at it. So now it's the 1990s. Which one of these characteristics of the existing industry changed? All of them, really. First, ownership, the big one. The political push was to privatize companies as fast as possible, so they would be able to catch the Western economies through new owners who knew how to handle the free market. At least that was the theory. I already talked about this in episode number 90. Many companies were now under the wings of larger Western brands. Those were able to buy the aging factories and hardware somewhat cheaply, plus employ the very cheap local labor, cheap compared to the West, of course. This was mostly the case of the larger industries, most notably vehicle manufacturing, related parts and such, but also, for example, manufacturing of structural materials, so cement factories, factories of bricks, tiles, steel, although a lot of steel factories simply closed down, insulation materials, chemistry, you name it. Since I really already covered the economic part or even the political part a little bit in episode 90, which was the 1990s introduction, let's now focus on how all of this changed cities, because it really did. So first, how were old factories doing? Not very well, usually. This is actually quite a paradoxical case of city development of the previous era, from 1950s to roughly 1970s, during the height of the modernist approach to city planning. Modernists ideally wanted a perfect utopian division in cities, move dirty factories totally away from the city, functionally separate them, build a nice and clean, uniform city of the future. The communists, of course, gladly worked with such noble idea, while fueling it more by complaining about the previous city developments, how the capitalists made cities wrong, too dirty, too chaotic. And indeed, new industry was built in separate industrial areas, away from the built areas. But that was just a fraction of operational industry at the time. There were still the huge, sometimes even 100-year-old city factories, still continually expanded, simply because moving them elsewhere was too costly. It is yet another little illustration of how the utopian visions for cities of the future kept hitting a brick wall of economic reality. So the evil capitalist chaotic buildings of the past were quite handy throughout the communist decades still. Modernism as a style was abandoned, functional separation in cities too, yet the old city factories were gradually abandoned and removed, so in a way fulfilling the old original visions, especially when sort of replacement factories started popping up on green fields outside of cities. Good example of this is the old Ringhofer factory in Prague, later taken over by Czechia to manufacture the famous Tatra trams. Even in the 1930s, it was already in the middle of a district, practically in Prague's broader center. It remained there all the way to the late 90s. When building trams, the half-finished vehicles had to be moved between factory buildings, through city streets, between traffic, between pedestrians, while the factory itself was bursting at its seams already because it made trams for the vast majority of Eastern Bloc cities. Also, for example, the Eisenach car factory in East Germany. It was established all the way in the 19th century, with its factory exactly in the middle of Eisenach city. Later in the communist times, it made the Wartburg cars, and in the 90s it closed down, with buildings gradually removed or turned into something else, while practically a direct replacement Opel factory opened on the city outskirts. And many examples of old brake factory buildings all around other European cities. Why were these old factories torn down? Well, many reasons. Companies occupying them mostly went under or just moved elsewhere. The buildings were already in a really bad shape, expensive to run, unfitting modern manufacturing, and in prime locations for future city development. It also started to be clear that factories will move away from heavy rail transport to frequent truck logistics, which just cannot happen on city streets anymore. Not all old factories shared this fate, although the vast majority did. Some buildings, through luck, I guess, survived and later when the time was right got refurbished into expensive housing or offices, but that's gonna be a topic for the future. I lightly touched cargo transport, so let's continue with that. Despite Central to Western Europe being a region with the highest railway coverage in the world, industry still opted for more road trucks, delivering materials and exporting products. Reasons are, again, many, but it relates to the nature of more varied industry, delivering to many more businesses, factories needing many more different parts from different directions, and it's just easier for a company to establish road supply chains, especially now when those companies are not centrally directed, like in the communist days, when it was easier to command infrastructure and factories together. This also connects to globalization. Borders opened, not only for people, but also for much easier trade. Suddenly, it became the norm that companies bought parts abroad, shops ordered foreign products, and all of that required new, huge logistics facilities and infrastructure. Infrastructure relates mostly to highways. We already talked about those, how it was important to set up the internationally significant corridors. Logistics then required new storage spaces along these paths, so warehouses began popping up left and right of these new highways on the green field on the city's outskirts. So that is another key factor in shaping cities or building projects related to cities. Globalization in terms of the economy, of course, also meant that countries did not need to manufacture mostly everything anymore. Foreign competition was now available, not only from the continent, which led to many businesses closing down. It also helped that people just wanted to buy the foreign stuff and not the old communist brands, especially right after the transition, which further made the local businesses struggle. As a result, today, a good part of the population sees that development as a mistake, especially in those regions where major manufacturers vanished and got replaced by cheaper imports. Although it's not quite as simple, because it's also a question of quality, availability, and so on and so on. Does that mean that industries just vanished from Central Europe? All factories were torn down and people don't have any jobs around here, just staring at a ceiling all day? Well, it depends on the region, the city, or even a district. The worst hit were the practically company towns. the sort of new residential neighborhoods built as part of one new factory expansion. This can be illustrated by, for example, the former East German Neustadt district in Halle. Even just looking at it from above, it's crystal clear that it's not quite built as part of the city, but rather as a dormitory of a nearby chemical plant. But looking at the chemical plant, there's not much left these days, even though it's not totally gone and some fraction of the original jobs are present still. Similarly, there is the Czech city of Ostrov, mostly built up in the 1950s following the monumental socialist realism style to accommodate families and workers of the nearby uranium mines. So it's even more extremely a company town, a single industry dormitory, much more than Halle, which at least used to be already a city doing city things. Uranium mining ended in the 60s and communist planners simply ordered the construction of a Škoda trolleybus factory. That factory used to work until the early 2000s when it closed down, although by that time many smaller businesses appeared near Ostrov and keep appearing there still, making the city an actual robust city, not depending on one single company. The new businesses range from light manufacturing to online shopping warehouses. Urbanistically or placement-wise, these new facilities follow a very common trend around here. Ostrov received a big road bypass in 2005, not technically a highway, but very highway-like, and the new buildings appeared conveniently next to it, next to the new interchanges, and all with a bus stop for not only local public transport. Railways are completely skipped with this new industry. In this case, there would be no way of even adding them since the terrain is quite hilly, so relying on roads meant that factories could now be much more freely placed as well. Privatization of existing industry was a political thing, of course, both legal and illegal, but getting the new players to come to the post-communist countries was very political too. Politicians needed to decide conditions, boundaries, locations to more or less cover the more unfortunate regions, and so on and so on. Car manufacturing was pretty much exactly that. In 1993, West German Audi arrived to Hungary and massively invested into its gigantic factory in Győr. Győr is a much larger city with many existing industry, including some of the very old factories this time, after which we can see the so-called brownfields near the city center, so places where the buildings were demolished and now waiting for new purpose. Comparing the brownfields and the new Audi plant, it's very obvious how these old places just could not fit the contemporary style of large-scale manufacturing, so the push of industry further away to the outskirts is just engineeringly logical. But many of the old industry, as you can see, is still there, except it's not some one factory, but many smaller businesses. Light manufacturing, garages, warehouses, some got turned into supermarkets, and so on, while being within walking distances of people's homes, because the city just keeps growing around. Car production and Hungary is also a great example of a total economic switch, since Hungary was not producing any personal cars before, but now it would make the same amount of cars as Germany, for example, relative to the population. That of course required a huge change in education, in workers' specializations and supply chains. Making cars is not just happening in a car factory, but there has to be a billion other smaller factories making all sorts of parts relatively nearby. So the money spent to make all of this happen were astronomical. On the other hand, car manufacturing in Czechia already had strong tradition. Škoda factory got acquired by West German Volkswagen already in 1991. The factory in Mladá Boleslav was already standing, together with its own, basically another company town nearby. But unlike in Halle, the production kept going, kept growing, and the district is doing all right. The size of the factory is absolutely ridiculous compared to the city, and perhaps its historical continuation is the reason it is this integrated into the city urbanistically. It's right there. Speaking of the supply chains, some 40 kilometers away is Liberec. a border city which was hit quite hard with closures of traditional industry in the 1990s, textile works mostly. But since then, the city practically became Škoda parts workshop and logistics warehouse. New factories appeared mostly near the newly built kind of highway heading straight to Škoda factory. Here we can notice the new trend of the 21st century in Central Europe, which is the creation of industrial zones. Now, industrial areas are of course nothing new, we have seen that, but not quite zones as we know them today. These zones are following layouts of roads and urbanism actually almost identical to residential car suburbs. You have the same road hierarchy, although beefier for semi-trailer trucks, and then the individual plots of land for individual companies and their factory halls, divided by some greenery, but quite obviously not built as a single project, as a single factory. For you Western viewers, this is likely nothing new, but in post-communist Europe, this was very new. Car production was also significantly increased in Slovakia, with brands such as Volkswagen again, Kia, Peugeot, Citroën and more. Since I already mentioned the Hungarian statistic of cars made relative to the population, this is actually quite interesting for Central Europe. So, where do you think most cars are made in the world? Probably in some traditional car countries, right? United States, Germany. No, in Slovakia, relative to the population, of course. So here's the chart. Slovakia with some 222 cars per 100,000 citizens, then huge drop followed by Czechia and then the usual suspects. So South Korea, Japan, then we have Hungary, which is practically similar as Germany. That's quite interesting. And the United States is very, very low in here. On one hand, this is impressive, I guess. On the other hand, it's very dangerous because the economies of especially Slovakia, Czechia or Germany are so relying on car production that slight hiccups in the sector can cause massive economic problems. It also kind of means, sadly, that you cannot exactly speak against car dependency in these countries or their environmental impact unless you want to undermine the state economy, since the line always needs to go up, of course. It also fuels the talks of the countries just becoming a workshop of the large Western brands and even more points to the nostalgia of the good old days of much more diversified industry. Well, anyways, that is that for the little introduction to how new factories looked, how old factories ceased to look, and what sort of things were made around here by who. We will of course touch these topics again, as it's all connected in the entire city development. We will certainly return to the topics of rebuilding the old places left after the old factories, the challenges of it, and the realities, and we must also return to the fate of the panel housing district that got hit by the industrial changes a lot in some places, especially in East Germany. Anyways, let's now talk about what I'm building in our example of a city that is going through similar changes as the real world. So the first project was the logistics warehouse. It was a small one. It's located on the side of a highway, the one where we have been doing the gas station and the casino nearby, and it's next to the big residential district, so it provides a couple of jobs for that one. I also built a bus station next to it, or bus stop, so there's a bus line going to it. There already was a bus line in the area, so I just extended it that way, so that was kind of convenient. Then I wanted to build something similar, like a light project, so I moved into this location. It soon became obvious that I wanted to build a car factory, and obviously a car factory is going to be much bigger than some random logistics warehouse, so it turned into this. Now, a car factory, or any kind of factory of this size, requires its own access to the highway, or at least, you know, a highway interchange nearby. So I had to build one. That's like the third project today, because, you know, highway interchanges are fairly complex, at least can be in city skylines if you decide to build them, you know, better, I guess, compared to the vanilla roads. So it took some time, obviously, with all the intersection marking tools, all the changes with the node controllers, just to make sure that it looks all right. You will see that in the cinematic. Actually, I will return to it, I think, in the time-lapse still. No, I have already done that, the detailing there. Anyways, now I'm working on the car factory itself. It's much smaller than, the real-life car factories, especially the big ones that we have seen in the introduction or the real-life background. But I don't really have bigger spaces available, and also I don't really have that many factory assets anymore, because I have spent a lot of the historical buildings already in the city. I cannot really use them for the modern factories, and for the modern factories I really have only a handful of buildings, so I don't really want to create like a super repetitive factory, which this one is anyway. But still, I just don't really want to do that. So this car factory is going to be a little scaled down. It's going to miss some things from real life, but still, I think, these days I'm building projects in Altengrad to kind of make a point, so that it makes sense to compare Altengrad to the real world, and for that purpose it's perfectly adequate. Now, by the way, here I did something really interesting, something that I was kind of hoping that City Skylines 2's factories are gonna be all about, and that is, I used the building spawn points and I made it so that, just like in a real car factory, there is like an entrance for trucks, and then there's like a big warehouse where all the trucks are going to and unloading their various cargo. So that's exactly what I did right here. As you can see, I already have some vehicles moving around here, and they are going into these loading bays, and each loading bay is dedicated to different building in the factory. For some reason, it actually matches the number of loading bays that I did here randomly, so that's really nice. And you will see that in the cinematics that, unlike normal industrial zone in City Skylines, here the trucks truly only go to that, like a drop-off point at the start of the factory. So that's a little bit more realistic compared to the standard behavior of the game, and it's just great. It's just working great as well. So yeah, building spawn points, one of the key mods for City Skylines 1. Seriously, it's I remember back in the day when I got it for Aurelia. It's an old mod, but right from the start it was just absolutely amazing, and you can really do great things with it. It's definitely up there with intersection marking tools and these kinds of mods as well. So yeah, so back to the logistics warehouse for that quick cinematic right there. Not exactly a big project, like I said. And then there is the car factory, which is a much bigger project. Here I actually had to do some more planning regarding the future highways and some future projects around here. That's kind of the reason for the shape of this interchange, because, I am planning ahead some different factories, different warehouses, different interchanges as well, different connections. So yeah, it was not exactly all that super easy, super random to put this together. I really like the traffic flow in this area. This is exactly, finally, that sort of traffic flow that I wanted to achieve on the highway system in Altengrad. So we finally got the traffic. In the future, I would like to maybe revisit some of these interchanges and make them a little bit better. I was looking at some real-life examples where these sorts of industrial roundabouts are, and they definitely are frequently refurbished, added more lanes or changed into some like turbo roundabouts and these sorts of things. So we could probably do that as well. These sorts of industrial places, those are great places for trying the bigger traffic solutions. So yeah, I would really like to revisit some of these in the future. Thank you for watching this video. I will see you in 2 weeks with a new one as usual. Huge thanks to channel members who are becoming channel members to directly support this channel. I really appreciate your direct support. It's kind of keeping me motivated, of course, to keep going. And of course, if you liked this video and you would like to, do something a little bit to help it, then you can do all the writing, clicking and sharing and thumbing up below the video as usual as well. So that's gonna be all. Take care. Goodbye.